Why, hello. Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here. And I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church here in the Battleground area in Washington, the state of Washington, just outside of Portland, Oregon. We're on the normal side of the river, and as opposed to the weird side of the river. And we're happy about that. But anyway, I've written some books. One of those books is entitled In the House of Tom Bombadil, and that seems to be received well. And I've been talking to lots of people about it on all kinds of podcasts and in different places. And that's enough about me. How about you, Tom? Introduce yourself.
I'm Tom Price. I teach systematic theology, Christian ethics, and from time to time, philosophy and a few other things. One of the places is at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And I am in Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut, West Hartford, Connecticut, filled with snow. We had another it only ended up being about 4 inches of snow and then a good glaring of ice.
Well, our hearts go out to you. Our hearts go out to you. So, Glenn, you're not in Connecticut, nor are you in Washington. You are in Indiana. So tell us a little bit about yourself, and then maybe just go ahead and bring us into the subject of the day. It's kind of a subject that everybody's talking about right now.
Yeah, I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, a ministry associate at Reflections Ministries, and a retired history professor from Central Connecticut State University. And I relocated to South Bend, Indiana. Today, I thought it would be a good idea in view of current events to talk a little bit about Ukraine, some of the history of Ukraine, its connection with Russia, how that relationship has worked or not worked over the centuries. And along with that, maybe get into a little bit of a discussion of the idea of nationalism from a biblical perspective. So we'll see how far we actually get. I think it's important, though, when we're looking at Ukraine and Russia, almost everybody seems to be focused on just the last century. You know, all of the discussions I've seen really focus on the period from the Russian Revolution to the present. I think we got to start back a little bit further than that, like about 1,000 years further.
All right, give us the story, Glenn.
So let's start off with everybody's favorite group of barbarians, the Vikings.
All right.
And the Vikings were sailing from Sweden primarily down the Russian river systems, doing what Vikings do, raiding and all of that kind of thing. They went down the Russian river systems, switched to others, ended up in the Black Sea, from there made it to Constantinople and so on. And it's actually the Vikings, specifically the Swedes, who start the first Russian kingdom, which they establish at Kiev in the 9th century. They were called the Rus at that point, and our word Russia comes from this group of Vikings that settled there. There's some debate about what the word Rus means. The Finns use it to refer to Swedish people. They call the Swedes the Rus. And it appears, according to at least some etymologies, that the word may be related to the word for red, as in the Swedes had red hair and red beards, and so they were known as the Rus. But in any event, Kievan Rus was the first of the Russian kingdoms.
Okay, let's stop here a second and just think. Now, I don't have any knowledge of this. This is the first I've heard of this, Glenn. Now, one of the things to also note is that the Vikings got around. They have a significant role in Irish history, the history of Scotland, the history of Britain, and I'm confident lots of other places too. But this is pretty far from home. I just didn't ever make a connection between Sweden and Russia.
Yeah, well, that's because we're Western European descent, and all of our history is focused on Western Europe. We never really paid much attention to the East, but there was a lot of really interesting things going on there. As far as generally the Vikings go, when I was taking my doctoral candidacy exams, one of the potential nightmare questions that came up was, did the Vikings have a net positive or negative effect in Europe? Because you can make a really kind of, the argument gets really complicated. I mean, there are stories of Icelandic merchants purchasing Irish princesses as slaves in a market in Sweden, I believe it was, using gold from Baghdad. That's how extensive the trading network went.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so in any event, yeah, and a lot of that actually occurs through the Russian river systems. Well, in 988, Prince Vladimir of Kiev decided to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy in order to marry the daughter of the Byzantine emperor. This was a major status thing for him, but the deal was he had to become a Christian. So he became a Christian, and so Kiev fell under the Patriarchate of Constantinople, not Rome. Okay. So the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe, among the Slavs, has roots earlier, but the main beginning of at least the church among the Rus was through Constantinople at Kiev. Okay. By the way, the word Rus started off being referring to the Vikings and then the people from this kingdom, and then it became generalized to cover a lot of the Eastern Slavic peoples.
Okay.
Kievan Rus is considered the cultural foundation of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine.
So before you go any further, Glenn, I'd like to hear some background, if you have it, on the name Slav. I've heard it associated with slavery, but I don't know if that's a correct association.
It's actually the other way around. Our word slavery comes from the Slavs, not Slavs from slavery. And that's because in the early Middle Ages, the overwhelming majority of slaves that you ran into in Europe were people who had been captured in Eastern Europe and then sold west, or for that matter, sold into the Muslim world. Okay. And the net result is in every Western European language, the word for slave is etymologically related to the word for Slav.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so Kievan Rus gets Christianized, Christianity spreads, but it's right on the frontier between the Orthodox and the Catholics. And during the Middle Ages, what we call today Ukraine was known as Ruthenia. And the Ruthenians, their primary interaction was really with the people to the north, the Poles, and along with that, the Lithuanians. Now, Lithuania at this point also extended as far as Belarus, so it was a rather large territory. And then the Ukrainians were really unhappy with this arrangement because, frankly, the Poles were dominating the Ruthenians. And as a result, in 1490, there would be a revolt by the Ruthenians to get themselves out from under Polish domination. 1569, Poland and Lithuania joined together in what's known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania at this point does include Belarus, and it's worth noting that both of them had a strong Protestant population in this period. As a matter of fact, this is the period known as the Golden Age of Belarus, and it was heavily influenced by Calvinism, one of these things that we know nothing about over here. In any event, once the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth comes about, Poland basically takes over Ukraine. And while they did really a lot of good in some ways for Ukraine, there was also some damage that was done. Among other things, a lot of the nobility began adopting Polish language and culture and abandoning the native Ruthenian or Ukrainian culture, while the peasants stayed with their old culture. The nobles tend to convert to Catholicism following Poland. The peasants tend to stay Orthodox. So there are a lot of tensions here. The Poles were not shy about turning a lot of the Ukrainian peasants into serfs. A lot of them would end up resisting. And this group of peasants that resisted the Poles became known as Cossacks.
Right.
Okay. In the middle of the 1600s, the Cossacks found themselves stuck between three different powers: the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Ottoman Turks to the south, and Tsarist Russia. Ultimately, the Cossacks will ally themselves with Russia in the middle of the 17th century as a way to basically fight off the other powers. And the territory became a protectorate at that point. This is the first time the area of Ukraine had any real connection with Russia.
So let me just stop here and just kind of zero in on something. So the Cossacks have their origins in Ukraine, as I'm hearing you say, but we associate the Cossacks with the Russian Revolution today, and what was going on at that time. So for most of us who have any awareness of what occurs in that part of the world, that might be the only kind of thing that we would have any sense of.
The Cossacks are actual Ukrainians.
Right. Yeah.
So, interestingly enough, Ukrainian peasants who didn't want to be turned into serfs.
Right.
Then in 1667, Russia ended up signing a treaty with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that divided Ukraine between the two of them. So Ukraine gets partitioned at this point. And from this point on, you really don't see an independent Ukraine. You've got Ukrainian culture and language and things like that, which is related to Russian but isn't the same. But they're always under the thumb of someone. The Tsars began to exercise more and more control. There were a series of Cossack revolts against Tsarist rule. Late 1700s, the Russians will destroy the Cossack forces. And then Ukraine will be partitioned once again. This time, Poland also gets partitioned. So the part of Ukraine that had been absorbed by Poland is gone. Instead, the western part of Ukraine gets put into Austria, and the eastern part goes with Russia.
Okay, so we've got a history of things kind of occurring in the Ukraine in which different portions of that territory are parceled out to different great powers. Now, one of the things that's intriguing to me is that as you describe this sort of story, this history, Glenn, is the role of Poland in all of this. One of the things I think that a lot of us today think of when we think of Poland is this particular place that gets beat up all the time by Russians and Germans. It's just sort of like, this great big empty space that is being fought over by these great powers to the east and west. But at one time, Poland itself was a significant power in the region.
Right. Yeah, I apologize for any background noise here. We're having people over for dinner and my wife is cooking.
All right. Well, that's all right.
If you're hearing background noise, I do apologize.
I think I hear the
that.
Instapot.
Yeah, well, it's actually, we're doing Chinese, so it's not quite an Instapot. But in any event, if you are familiar with older movies, I think it was Yul Brynner and Tony Curtis. There was a movie called Taras Bulba, which was actually a movie based on a novel. And the novel was dealing with the Ukrainian War of Independence from Poland.
Interesting.
So there is that. That's a sort of cultural thing that you may be aware of. By the way, this period also sees changes in the church in Ukraine. So we've already gotten a Ukrainian Catholic Church. There are a number of Ukrainians that agree that the Pope is the head of the church, but they're allowed to keep an Orthodox liturgy, an Eastern style liturgy.
Right, yeah.
So they're Eastern Rite Catholics. Mm-hmm. However, under Peter the Great, who was the Tsar in Russia between 1682 and 1725, the relationship of Kiev and Moscow changes significantly in terms of religion. So up to this point, the bishop in Kiev was considered a metropolitan bishop. That's a step above an archbishop. Moscow, however, had got itself named as a patriarchate. And in 1686, the patriarch in Constantinople wrote a letter that basically shifted the authority over Kiev to Moscow. And then in 1722, also under Peter the Great, the status of the Metropolitan of Kiev was reduced to that of an archbishop.
Interesting.
So Moscow is now dominating religiously in Kiev. By the way, they also shut down the Ukrainian Catholic Church is also shut down during this period.
Okay. So about how long does that go on? Do you have any sense of like the time frame that occurred?
Well, that's going to be in place for quite a while, centuries, in fact. The letter that was given to Moscow, subjecting Kiev to Moscow rather than to Constantinople, wasn't rescinded until 2018.
Wow.
And in 2018, the Patriarch in Constantinople said that letter was illegitimate because it was the product of simony. Basically, he'd been bribed to do that. Therefore, it was invalid. And once that happened, Kiev, now this is after Ukraine has gotten its independence. And at this point, Kiev, the Patriarch in Constantinople makes Kiev, the next year in 2019, makes Kiev autocephalous, that is to say, self-headed. It's not under any patriarchate. They've got their own Orthodox church there. The Patriarch of Moscow rejected this. He said that's illegitimate. They're still under us. That's going to come back to haunt us today, in fact.
Yeah, and then to make this whole matter even more sort of difficult to keep straight, we have these Eastern Rite Catholics in this part of the world who are
who have reemerged as the second largest religious body in Ukraine.
Yeah, and over many centuries of being unrecognized and probably persecuted, I'm assuming.
And it tends to be closer, more predominant, closer to the Polish side.
Right. Near Poland.
Yeah.
So this gets us to the 1800s. Nationalism is sweeping across Europe, largely in the wake of Napoleon. And as a result, you get a real push for Ukrainian language and culture within Ukraine. This is actively discouraged, to put it mildly, by the Russians. The net result is a lot of Ukrainian intellectuals ended up fleeing to surrounding countries. The native Ukrainians are largely kept down as peasants. They're dominated by Germans and Poles and, of course, Russians. The peasants start looking to Russia for help. But given the pressures by Russia on the Ukrainian leaders, the peasants stopped looking to Russia and started really wanting their own country. And this is where you're beginning to see a real push away from empire and toward this idea of, even the peasants at this point want a Ukrainian nation. 1830s, by the way, I got it wrong. Peter the Great didn't suppress the Eastern Rite Catholic Church. That happened in the 1830s. Jump to the 20th century. Russian Revolution happens. Ukraine tried to get its independence during the Russian Revolution. However, they really couldn't get their act together. And, there were multiple Ukrainian republics declared, but ultimately in 1921, Ukraine became a Soviet Socialist republic and was absorbed into the Soviet Union.
Now, was there some payback for all of their resistance due to the policies that Stalin?
Yeah, and that's where things get really ugly. Stalin seems to have really had it in for the Ukrainians, who weren't entirely happy about it being integrated into Russia. And between 1932 and 33, there was something that goes by a variety of names: the Great Soviet Famine, sometimes the Holodomor. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. This was a famine produced by Russian policies that killed up to 10 million people, most of them Ukrainians, many of them in the eastern part of the country, which was then resettled by Russians.
Yeah, well, that comes into play here. Now, am I correct in remembering that Stalin had a connection to Ukraine? Is he ethnically Ukrainian?
Stalin was Georgian, if I remember right.
That's right.
By the way, one of the reasons for the famine was forced collectivization. It was the refusal to send tractors to the Ukraine. The distribution of tractors didn't put tractors in the Ukraine, even though it was the most fertile farmland, arguably in the world. I mean, it is easily the most fertile in Europe, and maybe the most fertile in the world. Then they also set really high quotas for the peasants, so that when whatever food they grew, that was confiscated by the government, and so on. And that result, millions and millions of Ukrainians dead. 3.9 million by direct starvation.
See, these are the kind of the data points that I don't think most Americans ever hear, discussed, or maybe even more broadly, anyone talk about.
Right. Yeah, but believe me, the Ukrainians have not forgotten that.
Oh, sure.
And as a result, during World War II, Ukrainian partisans fought against both the Germans and the Russians.
Interesting. Yeah.
They were trying to get their independence once again.
Right.
Unfortunately, it didn't work out so well for them. They continued to be part of the Soviet Union. Then the next step is 1986, where a combination of inadequate instructions in their manuals, operator negligence, poor design, all of this led the nuclear power plant at Chernobyl to melt down and explode. And this spewed radioactive debris all over the place into some of the most fertile farmland in Europe. And the International Nuclear Event Scale, this was one of only two disasters that have occurred that ranked as maximum severity, the other being the Fukushima disaster in Japan.
Right.
So this was a really, really serious problem. Today, 1,000 square miles in Ukraine is taken up by the exclusion zone around Chernobyl. 1,000 square miles.
Yeah.
So then in 1991, the Soviet Union broke up. And once that happened, Ukraine was pretty quick to declare its independence. If you actually look at the statements made by Russian leaders then and by Putin himself, they saw no problem with this. The Ukrainians really wanted to get away from Russia. They blamed Russia for the famine. They blamed it for Chernobyl. Some even pointed to the dissolution of the Ukrainian Eastern Rite Catholic Church, all kinds of things. And frankly, they didn't want anything to do with Russia. Their centuries-long hope for independence was finally achieved. And not surprisingly, as happened with the other states on the edge of the western edge of the Soviet Union, like the Baltics, they ran west because they didn't really want anything to do with Russia because of the abuse they had suffered at the hands of the Russians.
Right.
Okay, so that's what's driving them toward NATO. Now, it needs to be said that the borders in Eastern and Central Europe are messy because although in principle we're talking about nation states, there are a lot of people from bordering countries that spill over into all of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. My own family history, for example, my great-grandfather was a Slovak he was from Bratislava, in a period when that was under the control of Hungary as that half of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Hungarians tried to impose Hungarian language and culture on the Slovaks. My great-grandfather was a newspaper editor and novelist, and friend of Leo Tolstoy, in fact. And he was resisting this, and as a result, he was exiled to America. That's
how you got here.
Yeah. And there's a whole lot of other interesting history there, but I don't need to go into that. But Slovaks in Hungary, Hungarians in Slovakia, there are problems there. Hungarians in Ukraine, there's tensions there. The Russians in Ukraine, there are problems there. And the fact of the matter is, Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Not quite as bad as Russia, but it's up there. And they really did mistreat the Russian population in the eastern provinces. We have to acknowledge this. But when you take a look at the overall history of this, it's really complicated. There's a lot going on here. But the whole point is, take a look at this from the Ukrainians' point of view. For several hundred years, they've been under the thumb of other powers. And frankly, they want their independence. And
Right.
I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation from them.
Yeah, when we think about that part of the world, there's a kind of well, I mean, we even create neologisms to describe ethnic conflict, like balkanization. There's this idea that this particular part of the world has been messy for as long as anybody can remember, and there's been longing there for independence. Like one of my favorite artists in the early 20th century is a fellow named Alphonse Murka, who is Czechoslovakian, and he is known for some of his murals celebrating the kind of the history of the Slovak peoples. Mm-hmm. And he was doing a lot of that work in Paris, mainly because he didn't have the opportunities back where he had come from. And there are lots of remarkable cultural achievements. When we think about that part of the world, mm-hmm. There are beautiful cities. There are artistic achievements.
Great composers.
Yep, great composers. But when it comes to the messiness of the region, is it in part? And I've never been there, and I've not looked at the maps very closely. Is it in part because there are few natural borders between areas?
That's a lot of it. You have to realize the steppes, this rolling hills and grassland, starts in Mongolia and ends in Hungary.
Yeah.
Interrupted by the Ural Mountains. But other than that, it's this, and it is the fact that it is so easy to go through that led several European states to attempt to conquer Russia. You get the Teutonic Knights coming in from Poland, you get Napoleon, later you get Hitler, and so on. And part of that is because the land, as long as you don't do it in spring, the land is really easy to traverse. In spring, it turns into the world's largest bog.
Right. But I think this is one of the things, I think, again, that we kind of miss, as we reflect upon kind of geopolitics, is how geography comes into play, particularly as Americans. I mean, here we are, isolated, two oceans on either side of us, two very sort of minor powers below and above us. We're pretty set, and I think that it leads to a kind of taken for grantedness on the part of many Americans that everybody can just get along. Why can't we just get along, as Rodney King said during the riots?
A couple of things I wanted to just mention before we kind of move from the point we're on now is the complicated history is very important, especially in relationship to the suspiciousness of a lot of Eastern Europe about the West, that it considers to be very decadent, and which is very decadent. And although the East has its own decadence and kind of hierarchies of power and, what we would consider almost like mafia type politics and corruption in every kind of institutional level, they see the moral fabric of the West as something far worse and something they don't want anywhere near their culture and society. And I think that you see, as especially the U.S. becomes more and more marked by the breakdown of the basic things for civilization and the power the West has to export this, especially into places close to that world. You can see the kind of lining up of even China, I think, is very troubled by that especially in relationships to masculinity and things of those natures. Those aren't small things here. There is, of course, the old tyrannical disposition, if you will, of kind of dominance, and this used to belong to us or does belong to us mentality. But there is also this meddling, especially with, we know there are enough going on with those in political power in the U.S. who have had their hands in Ukraine and their influence in Ukraine, which not to the common people, but to those in places like Russia and China is seen as a problem, and they want to deal with it
Yeah.
They want to deal with it. Now, it is sad, like you said, Glenn, because the average Ukrainian that is not kind of loyal to the kind of the Russian side wants their independence and their freedoms and things that they didn't get to experience. And there is a painful, long history of suffering and the like going on there. And it's a hard situation, and it is sad that we've had as a country our own hands in that pot, which hasn't made it more stable, but I think destabilized it even more.
Yeah. Well, the decadence thing is one of the major issues that led to Osama bin Laden. In the Muslim world, it's something that Putin very definitely plays up in contrasting himself and what Holy Mother Russia is compared to the West.
Yeah.
China is really right now in an active campaign against what it sees as effeminacy in men.
Yeah.
And all of these things are things that we are glorying in.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there. And the other part of it is that Russia has been invaded by the West at least 3 times. And so they feel like they need a security borderland, except the problem is that their domination of these borderlands has led these borderlands to want nothing to do with them.
Yeah. This is the complexity of the situation, but also the cultural amnesia of much of the contemporary West. I think it's probably less the case in places like Germany and France and even the United Kingdom. They have a better sense of
Sure.
this whole thing.
Yeah.
Here we are in the United States pontificating from this sort of like island. We might as well own the entire continent. And here we are with our preachments, kind of making our statements that have no sort of so they've not been informed by the realities on the ground.
Right. And we have a tendency to not remember the past. Europe doesn't do that so much. Most of the world doesn't do that so much. We tend, we look back maybe to the 50s.
That's right. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think that this is kind of the, when we think about our strengths and our weaknesses as a people here in the United States, on the one hand, you could say that this is a weakness because we tend to just sort of paper over really big matters. We just are always surprised to learn that the situation is more complicated than we know. But on the other hand, we're also able to, because we have such a short memory, kind of spend our time working on the present moment a little bit and kind of push ahead. And sometimes I wonder if maybe certain parts of the world are too steeped in the past. Now, I don't mean to be critical of historians. We need to know.
Oh, go ahead.
We need to know what happened in the past. But at the same time, we can't allow ourselves to be chained by it. Now, and that's a hard thing to navigate because when are you disloyal? Then all of this stuff because it's hard to work through.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is hard for us, especially as people from a Enlightenment country, if you will, is that it's easy for us to sever our identity from our history, but not for them. I remember when I was at a conference, theology conference at the Monastery de Bose in Italy, and it was a bringing of the Orthodox, basically every strand of Christianity from all over the world. And I remember when a particular Western theologian would get up and comment on iconography, the Russians would get up right away. A lot of these old school Russian women, and they would tell their history off the top of the head to correct everyone who got it off. And for them, it was a matter of identity and pride and everything to make sure you get the reading of things the proper way. And it was noticeable how hard line that thinking seemed to Westerners who were like, okay, well, that's your take on it,
Yeah, and it's remarkable how kind of insouciant and dismissive we can be when we don't even know what's going on. I think we have a tendency, particularly in the United States, to kind of read the entire world through our very short history.
Mm-hmm.
So even when it comes to matters related to ethnicity, there's a tendency for us to read the entire world through the experience of, say, the United States in the last 150 years.
Yeah.
So if you're white, then you have everything in common, as over against everybody who is of color, right? So we don't have any sense of the nuances with regard to the tensions between long-standing antagonisms in Europe.
Man.
Well,
not even Germany and France.
Well, again, just to take an example from my background, my grandfather was Czech, from Moravia, born in Brno. My grandmother was a combination of Slovak and Hungarian, despite the fact that her father was a Slovak nationalist opposing the Hungarians. This gets really complicated here. They were pan-Slavs. They were really trying to find a way of unifying all of the Slavic people. When they realized that this really wasn't going to work, they decided, well, at least we can bring the Czechs and Slovaks together. So one of my relatives is one of the major signatories of the Czechoslovak Declaration of Independence, with Masaryk and the others. The Czechs and the Slovaks they're very close to each other, but they couldn't get along.
Yeah.
The Slovaks were tired of being dominated by the Czechs. Net result, you get the Velvet Divorce, and Czechoslovakia breaks up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, our kind of tin ear for these different notes is something that even affects us in the United States. So, I was just the other night, I was with a bunch of friends, and I was talking about my experience in urban ministry in Boston. I was remembering a particular conversation I had with a Bajan, and this is a guy whose complexion is darker than mine. He's black in our parlance, and we're in this grocery store, and we're just kind of talking with each other. And there's a Haitian guy behind the counter who's ringing every customer up. And when you have a sense, and you've been around the various sort of subcultures of the Caribbean or the Caribbean, you can kind of see what you can spot a Jamaican, you can spot someone from Trinidad. You just have a sense. Okay, this person's from the Dominican Republic. Anyways, Haitians are very easy for me to spot. I can spot them across the street. That guy's a Haitian. Anyway, so we're standing there, and this guy turns to me, this Bajan guy. And he says to me, I hate those people. In other words, here I am, a white guy, Scots, Irish, and Swiss, and he is identifying with me over against the Haitian guy.
Yeah.
Now, I've got lots of Haitian friends. I have a lot of respect for Haitian people, and speaking of a country that's been under the thumb of another country. The United States has done a lot of damage in Haiti over the years, and the vast majority of Americans have zero clue what we've done to them.
Yeah.
Anyway, so here I am, and now if your typical white American from Iowa or Indiana were to look at a Haitian and an American black and say, "Oh, those are black people. They have everything in common." They don't.
Nope.
There are huge cultural differences between Haitians and American blacks. But can anybody, sort of identify those who haven't had some kind of long-standing history with these different groups? No.
And that's what I kind of meant by the kind of Enlightenment country that rips everything out of its roots and then makes the identity something that becomes constructed rather than. And this is why this can happen. It's the same in every similar in kind of my family as well. And those kind of things show up when you start to look. When people try to lump together, for example, European culture into one bag. Look, my family's on my mom's side, they're all from Finland. Okay, they don't share a language similarity with barely anyone else. And think of how different that makes everything else. But my wife is from Colombia, and she says one of the things that she noticed when she came here is they automatically assume all Latin and Central American people are all the same culture because they do share the same language. And they don't. And so most think, well, for example, if certain portions of Mexico like spicy food, all Latin cultures love and have spicy food, or they all should be living in the same area, or we should be culturally competent and relate to them all as if they're just one kind of group. And it is silly. And I think, again, it's one of these things that hurts our ability to properly, I think, receive the gift of others, but I think also to understand the history of other nations before we jump into interpreting them from a very limited range of experience.
Yeah, and that is exacerbated by the Latin American studies programs, which when they're done right, they don't homogenize things. But the very fact that you lump them all together in one thing tends to make it look like it's homogenized.
That's right.
I actually want to go off of this for a moment into the theological implications of this. Okay, we've talked about all the different cultures, and what I want to do is look at the word nation. The Greek word is ethne, from which we get the word ethnic. Okay, the idea here. Now, when you look at Revelation, it says that people from every nation and tribe and kindred and language are all going to be meeting together to worship the Lamb. Now, think about what that means. The word ethne is a little bit complicated. It can mean what missiologists call people groups, or it can refer to what we would think of as a nation. Basically, it's a relatively homogeneous group that shares language and culture and typically religion and things like that. That's really what the word nation refers to, okay, in Scripture. Now, what that says to me, the fact that every nation is going to be there, is that there is something about nationhood that survives into eternity. Just like individuals, people have sins that dominate their lives, frankly, and they need to be cleansed of those sins before they enter eternity. So nations have characteristic failings, but also characteristic strengths. They need to be cleansed of their failings, and their strengths need to be put under the authority of Christ, and then the nation survives into the eternal state. So I forgot who it was. I'm blanking out on his name. The guy who founded First Things with
Richard John Newhouse.
John Newhouse. Newhouse said something to the effect that when he comes before Christ at the Last Judgment, he expects to come before him as an American.
Interesting.
And a lot of people thought that what he meant was that as an American, he's saved. That's not what he meant. What he meant was that there is nothing about him that isn't colored by the fact that he's an American. That is his ethne, that is his nation. And as a result, when he enters eternity, he can't get rid of that. That's just going to be part of who he will be when he stands before the judgment seat of Christ. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. And what it suggests to me is that empire is not good, nations are. Because empire doesn't survive. Jesus is the only one who rules over all the nations.
Right.
Empire doesn't survive. Nations do.
Yeah. Now, when we think about nations, if we remember Abraham, the promise to Abraham is that he would become a great nation.
And that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through him.
Exactly right. So, Genesis 12, 1-3. Now, that if, I don't know how you can see or read that and not see an endorsement of this idea that nations are kind of in the divine plan of things, sort of in this divine scheme. But also there's also a connection to family. So here we have a family that grows into a nation. And that necessarily also brings into play the biological sort of genetic sort of lineage as well. Now that's a very touchy matter because we get into all kinds of things when that idea enters the room. And sometimes people will say, well, the United States, America is an idea. It's a nation founded on an idea, not an ethnicity. So there's an odd kind of thing that's happened here. But even in the United States, we have people who have observed that, this is a place that could break up in the way that the Soviet Union broke up. I don't know if you've seen, the book, The 11 Nations of North America, or 12 nations. I can't remember what it is, but it's identifying sort of regions and sort of kind of their histories and even their ethnic compositions to identify the kind of the fracture lines.
America is closer to the classic idea of an empire than a nation.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because sometimes people will say, well, we should learn, from the Romans, because the Romans were able to sort of incorporate people into the empire and citizenship. I mean, the Apostle Paul, for goodness sake, here's a guy who's an ethnic Jew who is a citizen of Rome. So they had kind of navigated these waters before we did. But still, I mean, when Rome kind of broke up, it wasn't as though they were able to completely eliminate these boundaries between nations. They were just trying to figure out how do you make it work.
Yeah. And this, by the way, also, I think ties in with something that Lewis and Tolkien talked about, where they talked about this idea of northernness.
Right.
And they had real admiration for the positive elements of Germanic and Norse culture, but recognized that it needed to be cleansed of its pagan elements and Christianized.
Right.
Yeah.
And when you do that, the virtues of the North come out and the vices are eliminated. That's the kind of thing that I'm envisioning when I see this reference to nations, every nation being before the throne. That's the kind of thing that I think is happening, that the characteristic vices of the nations are purged and cleansed, and the nation itself is then Christianized. The virtues, the good things about it are brought to fruition, and the bad things are purged.
Yeah, what's that passage in Revelation where the kings of the earth bring their treasures into, as tribute to the King, to Christ? Mm-hmm. Anyway, go ahead, Tom. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
I think there's a true biblical thread there that I think is really worth pursuing more on. But then there is also kind of the dangerous territory. I mean, this is something that happened with kind of the German Volk. And as you said, it wasn't purging off of the paganism. But what happened is a lot of times liberal Christianity started to to create something to where culture of a people and its experiences becomes sort of the equivalent of basically the way in which we interpret and read even the Christian faith. So it almost becomes identical to it for each group and people. And so one of the things I remember Karl Barth's work was coming against the German Christians when they started to associate God's will with the German culture. So as Germany started to take up its war policies and all of his liberal theological professors from Germany signed on, he criticized them and he said, this is very un-Christian. And their word to him was, that's your Swiss experience of God trying to challenge our German experience with God. And so because you're not German, you can't understand that. So, this is, I think, as you say.
Where have I heard that before?
Yeah, that's right. And so, but as you say, when we get the proper Christian theology filling that, the proper, the way in which we don't turn culture into an idol, that it is not, it's not it is a gift, and it has its contribution and continuity and nation and everything about us, without turning it into the kind of absolute that equates it almost with the Creator. then we're on good ground. I think Barth went too far the other way and basically made the word everything, to the point it eliminated any gift that culture could have or would produce, at least his later work.
Did you see this? Did you see this article of David Goldman over in Law and Liberty about Heidegger? He gets into this very thing, the destructive impact of cultural Heideggerianism, Heideggerianism.
Heidegger,
but it's getting into this very thing, Tom. If you look it up in Law and Liberty, you'll see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think that just like anything else, you can turn nation into an idol, and that's really what we're talking about here, where you allow your national culture to determine what is true or false, good or evil or whatever, and replace the Bible, replace the gospel, replace God's truth with cultural truth. That's why cultures need to be purged and cleansed. But the reason why I brought this up in this context is that I am generally very, very supportive of the idea of the nation state. Right. I think that is, I think empire, even though Christianity was born in empire, I think the entire trend of the gospel is away from empire. It is toward the nation. It is toward the ethne. It is toward the every nation, tribe, and kindred and tongue.
Right.
And this leads you to all kinds of discussions of things like subsidiarity and moral proximity and things like that. But that would take us way too far afield.
Well, this is where Yoram Hazony is, working. You're familiar with Yoram Hazony, the Jewish scholar, conservative thinker. He's an interesting guy. So the National Conservatism Conference, which is something that happens every year in the United States, is basically an attempt to sort of revive national sort of conservatism with the framework, or sort of outlook with the nation in mind, as opposed to sort of like, abstractions, the sort of abstractions we associate with, like, say, libertarianism or something like that. So when you talk about a concrete thing like these people, not ideas like free market, the idea of the free market, as opposed to, these people in this particular place and their interests. So those are two things that can actually be at odds with each other. In the United States, for example, blue collar people, people who have, for time out of mind, made their livings making things, have seen their interest undermined by a kind of ideological sort of commitment to the free market. So that means that people in China who are willing to work for a lot less money are putting, these blue collar people in America out of work. Now, you can pontificate about, unions and laziness all you want. But the simple fact of the matter is that we can go to parts of the United States now that are ghost towns, and we can see people who are drugged out on opioids because they've lost their reason for living. Is there anybody who kind of pays any attention to that? That's just one example. But the reality is there are some people in West Virginia, and those people have been betrayed by our policies, and they've been sacrificed on the altar of ideals. Rather than their own interest. And, people will come along and say, well, we just need to re-educate them, yada, yada, yada. But, what ends up happening is now they're working in, Chick-fil-A, to give a good example. Maybe they'd be working in, Burger King. But they used to be involved in something significant at a pretty high level, and they were making enough money to support a family. On one income, once upon a time. I remember those days, the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So for me, all this discussion about nations and what that means points us once again back to Ukraine.
Yeah.
And the situation there, I have no idea. By the time the show drops, I have no idea what the situation is going to be.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is This is an ethne. It's a related but different ethne, a nation from Russia. Even it's closer to Belarus than to Russia, but even then it's a different thing. It's got a different history. It's got a different culture. They're close to each other, but they're not the same.
Right.
And if, in fact, I understand the implications of the survival of the nations into the next world, the new heavens and new earth, if I understand that correctly, the Ukrainian desire for independence is something that we should honor. Now, with that, we have to acknowledge that it's a corrupt government. We have to acknowledge that the Russian minorities in the East that were imported in the 1930s haven't been treated well. We need to recognize where there is faults, because every nation needs to be cleansed by the gospel. We have to recognize our own faults as well, by the way, not just those of others.
Right.
But at this point, I think we need to be really mindful of what is going on over there, and what effectively is an attempt to reestablish empire, which properly only belongs to Jesus.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it all plays out. I've not looked into it very closely. There's a part of the story that I'm told that sort of focuses on the ethnic Russians who are in the East. But then there's this sense that maybe this is a more ambitious project to sort of bring the entire region back under Russian rule.
Which is what I suspect Putin has in mind. He's already said that, for example, the Baltics, he said that they really don't have any right to do what they did, join NATO and all of that.
Right.
He's really, I think Putin is really trying to reestablish empire.
It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. He's actually had some resistance from within the Russian world, so it's not as though all Russians agree with him.
Sure, and I'm not trying to attack Russians per se. I think Putin is a problem, though, personally.
Yeah.
Another thing that's worth noting, just as an aside, I've been told I teach evangelicals in Ukraine. I have been involved in an organization called the Christian Open Academy. Technically, I've been an adjunct professor or lecturer at the Ostrog Academy in Ukraine, which is the oldest university in Eastern Europe. There are all kinds of connections I've got over there. I really doubt this is the case, but there are rumors floating around the evangelical community there that Putin's hit list includes all the Protestants in the country because they're traitors to the Orthodox Church. So whether or not that's the case, the very fact that they're thinking this says something about the situation and how much trust there is of the Russians.
Yeah. The fact that their suspicions go in that direction. And as we noted earlier in the show, there is a pretty tight relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian government.
Yeah, right. And there's a lot of influence of the West through the Protestants, and so that's where a lot of the suspicions, especially even the old guard in Ukraine of Orthodoxy. I mean, when you're losing. When you're losing members of your church to these new groups, which are increasing and growing, some have called it sort of the Bible Belt of Eastern Europe. That's threatening to leadership, and it sees a tightening. An easy way to do it, sadly, for them is kind of force it to happen. And it's kind of like what we see. What happens with people don't like to lose control and have to actually contend out there with real challenges. And so, I mean, look at Trudeau in Canada, right? I mean, the minute he starts throwing the tyranny bit in which you try to use all the avenues you can to crush. And so the hierarchy of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine could definitely see it in that direction. I would like to pray and hope not. I hope they'll understand the significance of being Christian over this issue, but for them, they're much more blended.
Well, the patriarch in Moscow has basically blessed this invasion and said it's, for all practical purposes, said it's a crusade. wouldn't use those words, of course, but that's effectively what he said. And apparently, Putin thinks of America as the enemy, and America is a Protestant country. Therefore, the Protestants in Ukraine are the enemy.
Right.
That's how they perceive it, at the very least. Whether or not that's really the case is a different question.
Yeah.
But the fact that the perception is there, once again, points to this deep level of distrust.
Well, this is a good point, I think, to close the conversation. We have a number of people who listen to us who have Russian and Ukrainian backgrounds, and so we just need to be in prayer for those folks who love the Lord and are trying to do what's right, and they're in these different ethnic communities, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with these realities. And then, of course, there's just the realities, the situation there, and the fears that many people have that this could escalate into some kind of global conflict. I know that a lot of people in the conservative world are concerned that the Chinese are looking and sort of taking notes, and they've got their eye on Taiwan. And there's actually been leaked documents that indicate that is in fact the case. Yeah. If I were in their position, if I was a communist leader and I was looking at this situation from that perspective, that's where my mind would go. Definitely, the Americans, they're not really willing to defend the people that they've said that they would defend. Anyway, so we should probably wrap it up. We do appreciate your interest in the Theology Pugcast. We have a lot of folks who support us every month. Some folks. I think the majority of folks who support us do so through the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network, and we're very grateful for that. If you become a member of the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network and pledge to give to that organization, you can identify us at the Theology Pugcast as your podcast of choice, and then your giving will help us to offset the costs of our show. But then there are other ways that you can do that too. So anyway, that's probably all we should say for now. But we'll be praying for, obviously, the state of the world, the situation over there in Ukraine, and many of the people who love and support the show who actually listen to us who have Russian and Ukrainian backgrounds, and I suspect there are people in Russia and Ukraine who actually listen to us every week.
Yeah, I'm actually in contact with a pastor from Ukraine who let me know. I wrote him when I heard this. He found out about us from our show, and he sends a newsletter every month, and he let me know his sons were able to make it safely to where he is with his daughter. He lost his wife last year, so he's already been through enough. So this is challenging. So our hearts go out, and I have family there, obviously, on my son's maternal side. Plenty of relatives who are right in the crossfire.
Wow. Well, with those things in mind, thanks again for listening to our show, the Theology Pugcast. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye now.